Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired justice of the New York State Supreme Court. I first met Jim and Teresa Sheridan when they were living in Hell's Kitchen in a fifth-floor walk-up in a decrepit building that was falling apart. It was neglected, and they had their kids. And the thing was in the age of pre-gentrification in the early 80s on the west side. Their apartment was big and cheap with plenty of room for their children. Jim and I had a mutual friend. That's how we met, through the Irish boxer Barry McGuigan, about whom Jim authored a biography titled Leave the Fighting to McGuigan. Jim was interested in writing and directing a film about Barry's life, which eventually evolved into the famous film with Daniel Day-Lewis, The Boxer, a successful opus in itself. But Barry's life had very little to do with that, because Barry's life lost topicality when he lost his world champion status. And all of this was my bad luck, because I had written lyrics to a song on speculation, which would be the title song of the film, Leave the Fighting to McGuigan, composed by a friend of mine, Roger Rosenberg, an outstanding New York studio musician who now, in semi-retirement, tours the world with Steely Dan. Well, Roger and I recorded the song. Mickey, my friend Mickey Earl, was the studio engineer, and the song was sung by Barry McGuigan's dad, Patty McGuigan, who had won the Eurovision. He came in second place in the Eurovision Song Contest, and he was the Irish Eurovision winner. Anyway, Jim and Teresa were barely scraping by at the time. Jim was working in New York as the artistic director at the tiny but highly regarded Irish Arts Center. Jim's plays at that point had already been produced in Ireland, England, Canada, America, and Scotland, where he won the Theatre Award in the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. His talent was starting to be recognized, but not to the point where it paid off financially. Jim was getting by, but hardly. He had some minor legal problems with his landlord in New York in the tenement building, and I helped him out. I never took a fee. We were good friends, and Jim, his wife, Teresa, was a staunch ally and an excellent manager of the family's meager, financial resources. Jim and Teresa both were delightful people and excellent company. They were intelligent, highly spirited, and very, very happily determined people. The laughs were good and plenty. Typical was a story that Jim told about the time in the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. He was directing a play, and pressure was building on the cast because the premiere date was coming up quickly, and the rehearsals weren't going so well because one actor, whom we'll call Arthur Devlin, was in a sour mood and showed up drunk and real pissy attitude, and it was affecting the rehearsals and the rest of the cast. He was like a wet blanket, this guy. And apparently, Arthur Devlin's girlfriend was the cause of his bad mood, because 2 months earlier she left Dublin to find work across the channel in Liverpool, which a lot of Irish did. And he hadn't seen her, and he was getting restless and lonely and obstreperous and causing problems. And he went to Jim and he said, I want to take a weekend off and take the ferry to Liverpool to go see my girlfriend, but I need some money. Can I borrow some money? And Jim said, look, Arthur, if you want to borrow some money, I'll tell you what to do. I'll give you the fare. He says, you meet my wife, Teresa, at the bank tomorrow. She's going to get some money out of the bank, and here's the name of the bank. You be there at 9 o'clock, and I'll tell Teresa to give you the money you need. Okay. So next morning, Jim had told Teresa that evening that to expect Arthur to be there. And sure enough, front and center at the bank, 9 o'clock when it opened, was Arthur Devlin waiting. And Teresa said, Arthur, I don't have to explain. Jim told me last night, I know the score. I'm to give you, money to get to Liverpool. Yes, that's right, Teresa. Great, good. Okay. So she went in, got money out, and met him at the doorway or in the lobby of the bank, whatever it was. And she handed him 20 quid. 20 pounds for the fare back and forth, round trip. And Arthur had a face on. And he looked at Teresa and she said, what's wrong? He says, my God, he said, you just gave me fare. There's not even enough for a pint of Guinness on the way or on the way back. So she gave him 10 more. quid and sent him on his way. She went back home and told Jim there was Arthur, he was there, and I gave him another 10 quid because he wanted to buy Guinness. I wanted a pint on the way and on the way home. And I gave him 30, Jim, and Jim said, all right. He said, look, at least, thank goodness we got rid of him, He says, because he's been nothing but a pain in the ass and a fly in the ointment. He said, so I went to rehearsal that night around 5 o'clock. And all the cast is waiting for me to show up, and I'm feeling full of myself. And he says, and I spout out for all the cast to hear, what have yous done for Ireland today? I put Arthur Devlin on the boat for England. And they said, the fuck you did? Who's laying here on the floor, drunk as the Lord, passed out? Right behind where they were standing was Arthur Devlin. He had never left. He took the money, never made Liverpool. He never made it past the nearest bar. Son of a bitch got loaded. And Jim was deflated. So much for his ego and his big favor for Ireland. But that was typical of the stories that we would have back and forth with Jim and some of his actor friends. They were terrific people. Well, my friend Jim and I, it was 1986, and we were moving around New York boxing circles because Jim was looking still at that point in time for boxing background and material, that he would store away for the film project that he had in the back of his brain, And an interesting case came up at that time in the boxing world, and it was the talk of the town, and it was a very dramatic proposition, as a lot of boxing stories in New York are. So I called the case to Jim's attention, and we agreed to look into it as a possible film project where we could both collaborate and write a script with my boxing knowledge and his drama, his dramatic skills. Well, let's go back to June 16th, 1983. It was an eventful evening in the boxing world. Roberto Duran celebrated his 32nd birthday and fought the main event, a championship fight at Madison Square Garden, which was packed like no other fight for a decade before since Ali Frazier's first fight. And he knocked out 154-pound champion, junior middleweight champion, Davey Moore. And it was a sensational fight. There were 20,000 screaming fans in the Garden, and he had knocked Davey Moore out in about the 8th round. But that wasn't the most sensational fight of the evening. The most sensational fight of the evening was the fight, which was the preliminary just before the undercard, and it was a fight between Louis Resto, a journeyman fighter in New York, 154 up-and-coming young junior middleweight, and Irish Billy Collins Jr., a kid, another junior middleweight from Tennessee. And that fight ended after the regular 10 rounds. And Billy Collins Jr. was managed by his dad, who worked his corner, Billy Collins Sr. And he looked at his son after those 10 rounds, and Billy Collins' face, the fighter, was horrible. It was lacerated, swollen, bruised, beyond recognition. And the senior Collins was thinking to himself, how could this happen to my son fighting Louis Resto? Because Louis Resto had a reputation. He was a good fighter. He was an excellent boxer, but he had no power in his punches. It was said of him, he was a pressure fighter. He would throw a lot of punches, but none of them had it. They were all pity-pat stuff. And it was said of Louis Resto, Louis a good fighter, but he can't break an egg. That was the boxing expression. This guy can't break an egg. And that means he was no punch. And here he was, had inflicted fantastic damage on Billy Collins Jr. Well, this is all happening instantaneously. Papa Collins went over, suspecting something was wrong, ostensibly to shake Louis Resto's hand. And he grabbed Louis Resto's gloved hand and squeezed and realized something was wrong. There was no padding in the glove. The glove was like a mitten. It wasn't like a boxing glove. And it was wet. And he just held on to that. And it was all on film. It's always been seen. He held on to that hand and he started screaming, the gloves, get the gloves, get the gloves. And Resto was trying to twist away, but he couldn't because he had an iron grip on it. Finally, they confiscated the gloves. By the way, it took them 2 days to dry the gloves out. The gloves had all the horsehair missing. All the stuffing in the gloves was taken away, and the gloves were soaked. And I don't know if there was plaster of Paris. I don't really recall inside, but to make them a little heavier and harder. But they were soaked. Well, Resto had been given the decision, the majority decision. Obviously, the fight was then set aside. The verdict was set aside, or the decision was set aside, and it was declared no contest by the New York State Athletic Commission. About 1 year later, Billy Collins Jr. died driving his car over the side of a mountain in Tennessee where he lived. And it was determined that he had been drinking. Well, he had been drinking that night, but he had been drinking the whole year. His father maintained that his son really died, and some people thought it might have even been suicide. His father maintained that his son really died back on the night when he lost the fight to Louis Resto, because he went into deep depression for the whole year, and he started to become. He had been a good kid and had been training hard. He didn't drink, and all of a sudden he was a heavy drinker and as I said, highly, highly depressed. Well, some people disagreed with the whole interpretation, and that included Louis Resto and his cornerman Pedro Alvarado and his trainer in chief second Panama Lewis, who was a notorious character, best remembered for a subterfuge involving possible illegal administration of stimulants to Aaron Pryor during his war months earlier with Alexis Arguello. That fight was pay-per-view all over the world, and recorded in the fight was an incident in the corner. Alexis Arguello, who is a phenomenal fighter, was basically beating Aaron Pryor, who was also a tough kid, but he didn't have the style and the skill of Arguello. He was beating Aaron Pryor to a pulp. After so many rounds, in the late rounds of the fight, it was a 12-round fight, I think, or maybe even a 15-round fight in those days. In the late rounds, Aaron Pryor was thoroughly beaten and exhausted. He went into the corner, and on tape of the it's there for all to see, is Panama Lewis screaming to Alvarado, "Give me the bottle, give me the bottle." And he hands him a bottle. No, I want the small bottle, not that bottle. Give me the small bottle. Takes the small bottle, gives it to Aaron Pryor. Aaron Pryor guzzles that little bottle contents down and comes out of the corner like a lion. Here's a guy that was beaten sorely, and now he comes out like a new man. He's like a raging lion. The fight, he turns it around in the last few rounds, and he ends up beating Arguello. And that cemented the notorious reputation of Panama Lewis, who everybody knew was a cheat. And so some people said that maybe Everlast should be investigated, but the Everlast people are good people. They didn't build a world-class business because they were taking stuffing out of their gloves. They had nothing to do with it. They also sued. There was a lawsuit and an investigation involving the three boxing inspectors for the Athletic Commission, and two of them were acquitted. And the last, with a hung jury, well, they weren't acquitted. There was a hung jury. And the third one couldn't be convicted. And the judge, a guy named Blinder, the state was sued also. And he was acquitted. And the state was sued for neglect in failure to inspect the gloves. And the judge, a state court of claims judge named Blinder, dismissed the suit because the state was under no legal obligation under its own regulations at that time to inspect the gloves. Subsequently, as a result of the Resto fight, they changed the rules, and an inspector had to be present when the boxers put on their gloves. They were tied, and then they would wrap tape around the shoelace, around the boxing laces, the glove laces, around the wrist, and the inspector would sign his name on the white adhesive tape so that the gloves were basically sealed. But that was after the fact. Here, they had no obligation legally to inspect the gloves, so that suit was thrown out, and it was rightfully dismissed. Now we're back in 1985, and Jim Sheridan and I told him about this case, and we went down to Supreme Court criminal term in New York County, adjoining the infamous Tombs jailhouse. And it turns out we were looking for the records. I was looking for the court stenographer who took the records of the trial, because we were interested in that story as being maybe part of the movie that Jim was thinking of. And it turns out that the district attorney, Robert Morgenthau, in the interim, had obtained an indictment against Resto and Panama Lewis, and they were tried for assault and conspiracy and tampering with the outcome of a sporting contest. And both were convicted. Judge Eugene Nardelli sentenced Panama Lewis to 6 years in jail, and Resto got 3 years in prison himself. Well, the Collins family was dissatisfied. They sued the three commission inspectors. That never worked out. And Weeks after Billy died, the editor of Ring magazine, a guy named Randy Gordon, who later became the New York State Athletic Commission chairman, wrote an article about the fight and the death that followed under the title Murder, Plain and Simple. It was a notorious case. Well, the story never got written up. Jim Sheridan went back to Ireland with Teresa and the kids, ended up subsequently directing The Boxer and My Left Foot, which I think got him an Oscar nomination, if not the Oscar itself, I don't really recall, and as Best Director. And numerous other successful films, including one I think it was called In America, which was about his life in the tenement on the West Side, where he had gotten in trouble with the landlord that I bailed him out of. And Jim went on, did a number of other very successful films, and he became wealthy. And he had come back to New York a number of times over that time in his successful years and never returned my phone calls. So I guess we weren't such good friends after all. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.